All right, welcome back to another episode. So, in the last episode, we spoke about the idea that many people band together and create a company because it is in our DNA to sell, and people selling in teams is easier than people selling alone. Now, it's not just that why companies are created. We also spoke about taxation benefits. We also spoke about legal benefits. We also spoke about the fact that if you hire somebody and they make a big mistake, then the people or the individuals involved are protected, and a bunch of other things. In this video, we're going to look at exactly what companies are and how they're legally structured. What does the legal system think of companies, and how do they actually work internally? What is a CEO? We're going to learn about all of that in this episode. So here we go. All right, so let's talk about companies. So I want you to avoid looking at the left for now, and I want you to focus on the right side, or me. A private limited company, and there are many types of companies. We'll come back to the different types of companies, but a private limited company is a legal person. Legally, as a company, you are seen the same way as the legal system would see a person. That company has its own rights. If the company is sued, goes bankrupt, or has any untoward incident, the shareholders are legally protected from actions being taken against them. So if you hired some 50th employee who goes in and swindles or cheats somebody, then the company is liable, not the individual CEO of the company or the promoters of the company. They are not liable. It's the company itself that's liable. So you avoid taking damage for, some 50th or 60th employee of yours who makes a big mistake. That's the idea of a company. From a simplistic view, every rupee that enters a company is split between shareholders in the ratio of their shareholding. I think I made a spelling mistake there, but it's the ratio of their shareholding. Company decisions are taken by shareholders with the weight of their decisions depending on the ratio of their shareholding. CEOs who are also founders are actually quite rare, especially at larger companies. And I'll talk about why this is so. I mean, the kind of CEOs you see today of startups who are also the promoters and founders, that is actually a very rare breed of person. In reality, most CEOs are just arbitrators, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But now I want you to focus on the left side of this image, right? So you look at some money entering this entity that is a company. You see those dollar signs. And then the people who own the company, or the people who start the company, are called promoters. In this case, the promoter 1 has 30%, promoter 2 has 60%. Now, you see the CEO who has 9%, right? The CEO doesn't own the company. He or she doesn't own the company. And this, in fact, it is a very common occurrence, especially in the older days. And the reason for this is because the promoters of the company, usually they're old guys who want to own a company. They're like, okay, I have this idea for a factory, for a garment factory. I'll put in the money. We'll do all of that. We'll get somebody to run it, right? And the CEO is essentially the guy or the girl who runs the company, right? And the promoters are the guys who put money in the company, who attract business and all of that stuff. So traditionally, these were two different roles. It's only now that we see promoter CEOs. Now, the CEO has a few managers under him who have a little bit of, equity in the company, and all of those numbers, the 30%, 60%, 9%, 0.5%, they're all equity numbers on something known as an equity table or a cap table, right? Which is essentially like a small table of who owns how much percent of the company. And this is fairly obvious. And in the past, the promoters or the people who put money into the company are the ones who own most of the company. And as we will see in the next slide, a CEO is supposed to create maximum value for all of his or her shareholders. You should think of the CEO as a sort of therapist, right? Who keeps everybody happy and who makes sure that the value of everybody's shares keeps going up. So he's the arbitrator between the customers of the company, say somebody who's buying garments from the company, and the promoters and the shareholders of the company, right? He's the guy who keeps the balance between what these people need and these people need, right? And that, I think, is an important thing to understand when we look at CEOs of companies. In my company, for example, in Avalon, I'm the promoter and a CEO, but this is a fairly new occurrence, right? This is in 2019, we see many more of these types of founders and CEOs and promoters. In reality, the money that enters a company as revenue or funding does not directly drip to the shareholders. Now, you might think that, if the company makes 100 rupee profit and I own 50% and say you own 50%, then the minute a 100 rupee transaction happens, I take 50 rupees and you take 50 rupees. This is, in a simplistic view, correct, but in the real world view, wrong. The reason is because companies need they need to pay tax, they have some costs to bear, they have to do some R&D, all of that stuff. So if you look at the image on the left, there are some legal rules that prevent people from directly taking money out of the company. So companies need a reserve to run operations, they need money for R&D, they need money to do advertisements, etc., etc. Obviously, if the company makes 100 rupees and I take 50 and you take 50, who's going to pay for ads for the next year, right? So some shareholders might have different shareholding rights. Right? Some founder CEOs retain higher voting rights. So sometimes one share that a founder might own might have 10 times the voting rights that a later round investor owns. Right? So a lot of different rules that apply to a company and the kind of shares. And we will look at some of those rules in a bit. And these are documented in the modifiers. Now, the modifiers, it's a term that I've invented, right? But in the real world, it's just legal paperwork, right? What are the legal assets that bind a company? Or what does the shareholders agreement look like? So many different agreements that relate to a company that if you put all of those agreements together, you get, in essence, the rules by which a company operates, right? So you can buy shares in a company. At any point, you can decide that you can buy shares in a company. If the company accepts, then they will gift you shares or give you shares in return for cash. It is a way to take a bet on the potential of a company at some future date. And if I want to explain the idea of shares, I can do it very simplistically, right? A share represents the story of the company. As a promoter of the company, I could say this is the newest medicine to cure cancer. This company is going to cure cancer. And that's a story. Now, you as a shareholder or a potential shareholder, somebody who wants to buy shares, you might say, I think this founder is right. I think, there's some evidence that this product that they've developed can cure cancer. I'll take a bet on this company. So at the end of the day, when you pay, you are paying for a story. Shares are units of stories, right? And the potential of the company is denoted in its story. Right? So most really good founders, if you look at Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or whoever, apart from all the other skills that they have, they're also really good storytellers, right? They're able to sell the value or the potential of the company itself. They say, the company is worth X today, but I think it can be worth Y tomorrow because of these things. And some founders can actually realize that and execute that. So ideas are the basis of the story. Evidence, as the story becomes more and more real, then more and more people start coming in at a higher valuation. So most major shareholders have something called voting rights, right? All shares are not equal. So think about this, right? Say I own 10% of a company and you own 10%, and maybe there are 8 other people who own 10% each. And that means there are, 10 different shareholders with equal rights. Who decides what the company does? Tomorrow, if the company decides, okay, I think we need to buy some chairs for the office, who decides? It would be 10 people sitting and deciding, right? So in essence, how the decision happens is all the 10 people sit around a table and everybody says, I think we should buy shares, yes or no, right? A vote is called and people actually say yes or no. Simple, like depending on your votes. But in reality, different classes of shareholders have different rights. The earlier you took a risk in the company, you might still make, me and you 10% each, we might still make, the same money if the company sells. If the company sells at 100 rupees, both of us will make 10 rupees each. But when it comes to voting, I might have more voting rights than you because I came in earlier. I invested earlier. So how it works is the first round of a company is called the seed round, right? And the shares are denoted the class seed shares. The first formal round of funding, or technically the second round of funding, is called a Series A, and these are called class A shares. And Series B and Class B shares and so on and so forth. The earlier you came in, which is the higher risk you took, because at the seed round, you're just telling a story. You probably don't even have a perfect product or enough customers to demonstrate anything, right? So when you make these statements, somebody takes a risk, right? They put in money, and those people usually have better voting rights. So the voting rights are dependent on the class of the shares. Having 50% shares of a company does not mean that you have 50% of the decision-making ability unless all share classes have the same voting rights. So as you can see on the left, that's Mark Zuckerberg's shareholding. He has a 1x voting right on the Class A shares, but on the Class B shares, he negotiated a 10x voting right. So all his votes are worth 10 times as valuable as the next guy's votes, right? And that is the beauty of having voting rights, to maintain control even though you're losing the absolute percentage of the company. So you can maintain control and lose control of a company in two different senses, if you get what I'm saying. So when somebody decides to invest in a company, the agreement or the modifiers that we spoke about are documented in something called the Shareholders Agreement, which is all the people, the promoters, the investors, whoever, who are willing to come in and put money into the company. And this is primarily about money, right? When a company begins and in its early stages, obviously the product, the idea, all that matters, but it's the money that matters at the end of the day, especially when you own percentages of the company, right? So, for example, if you're a founder and you want to start a company today with a seed capital of 1 lakh, you still have to buy shares of your company. Whatever their value is. Maybe if you started in the Indian regulatory ecosystem, you need to pay, if there are two founders, one with 50% and the other with 50%, you both still have to pay 50,000 rupees each to buy your shares. So each share is available at 10 rupees and you have 10,000 shares in total. That's 1 lakh worth of shares, right? So, and you actually pay that money. So you're buying shares from the company. It's just that as the company's valuation increases, the people who buy shares from the company buy it at higher and higher prices. And that capital is used for obviously running the company well. So the modifiers we spoke about are documented in this document. So how do investors make money, right? There are two primary ways investors or promoters make money in a company. People who are on the share or cap table make money. At the end of the year, the amount of money, which are the profits, maybe a small segment of the profits, usually it's about 8% of the profits, are paid through dividends, which is the split of the profits at the end of the year. This money is split after all accounting, expenses, budgets for ads for the next year. Maybe the company got sued and they had to pay some amount legally. After all of that, what is left over is distributed among all the shareholders in a ratio. Usually this is about 8% of the profits. Very early stage companies and fast growth startups often don't have a dividend system because these companies rely on another way to make investors or to give investors value. And that is they actually sell the company. Right? So when say a Facebook comes in and buys your company at $1 billion, that is when all the investors get their money back. And we'll go into the actual mechanics of how each of these investors get their money back. How do you capitalize companies? What do you look at the assets like? We'll go through all of that in the next few videos, especially in the Meta Startup series. But this is how, two ways, dividends and an exit, right? Which is for a company to get acquired. There is a hidden third way, which is kind of somebody buys back your shares, right? Maybe one of the founders or somebody external says, hey, I'll buy your shares back. But that is, and these are called secondaries, right? Secondary exits. But these are usually not very favorable for the investors in the sense that they will get much lower than market rate for this. But in terms of market rate, an exit is the best option. So too many cooks spoil the broth, and it would be incredibly confusing if all 10,000 shareholders of the company voted on decisions, right? We've gone through this before. When you're a small company, you have just a few people. But when you become a massive public company, you have a lot of people owning shares of the company. Every company has a board of directors, a B of D, as I like to call it. It's a set of people who represent the shareholders, right? So it could be one person externally. It could be one person who actually runs the company on a day-to-day, the CEO, who is usually the chairman. It could be one of the main promoters. It could be all the promoters. It doesn't matter. Every company has a different board. In my company, it's me and Shashank and another gentleman who sit on the board who kind of manage the day-to-day activities and the long-term activities of the company. Boards have internal and external directors. Internal directors are people who actually work at the company and run the company, and external directors are people who have a one arm's distance with the company to give sort of an external perspective or an external view. Now you might ask why companies do this. Why even have an external director? And the truth is, it's mandated by the government to have an external director, especially at larger companies, and it's also a healthy practice to make sure that the company is not making too many mistakes. Boards are led by a chairman, which is the guy who sits. Technically it's the guy who sits on the main chair, but it's generally set by a chairman. It could be a woman as well, who sets agendas for meetings, determines board composition, and many other things. So that's about it, guys. We've covered what in essence a company is, and when we talk about the Meta Startup series, which is going to be included in Meta, we're also going to talk about how do companies capitalize, how do these different people come on board, who are investors, who are professional investors, who are angel investors. We're going to go through the entire thing. So let's hope that you guys are in for a fun ride.